Hi everyone, and welcome to our video all about evidence for natural selection. What we'll be doing in this particular video is having a look at specification reference 4.2.2e, the evidence for the theory of evolution by natural selection, including the work of Darwin and Wallace, and looking at specific evidence in terms of fossils, DNA, and the molecular evidence. First thing then, let's start with the scientist we've all heard about quite a lot, I would say, throughout our lives, good old Charles Darwin. The man whose name is synonymous with this whole idea of evolution by the process of natural selection. Now, what we actually have is Charles Darwin was obviously alive quite some time ago now, and what he did was he went on a lovely 5-year-long voyage on this ship called the HMS Beagle, and his key area was around the Galapagos Islands. Wasn't the only place he visited, but that's the only one we tell you about, really. Now, what he was doing as he was travelling around the Galapagos Islands on the HMS Beagle is he was making a lot of very detailed observations. So at each port of call, then he'd get off, he'd have a look at these different creatures on the island, and he'd make very detailed sketches, he'd collect samples, and he'd make a lot of notes on what he saw there. And what he was able to ascertain from all of this observation work that he did was that there was clear variation between members of the same species on these different islands. So he then came up with this idea that the variety of bird species were all actually closely related finches. In terms of the actual observations he was making that led him down this route towards his grand idea of natural selection leading to evolution, was first of all that the offspring appeared to be generally similar to their parents. He also noticed that no two individuals were identical to one another. They all had some kind of subtle differences. That organisms can produce large numbers of offspring, but the populations remained pretty stable in their size overall. So what he was doing during all of these 5 years of observations was he was noting all of these features down. And once he actually had all of these observations, it was then down to him to use a little bit of creative thinking to come up with an explanation for it. And the explanation that he went for was, despite the fact that there are large numbers of offspring being produced, the fact that the population remains pretty stable must mean that out of those large numbers of young, they've got to compete for those resources. There's not just an infinite amount of food, etc. Therefore, all of those offspring will be competing for resources which will be in a limited supply. Now, because those resources are in a limited supply, that means that the ones that are best adapted out of the entire little posse are going to be able to survive. And if they're able to survive, then hopefully they're going to live long enough to reproduce. So at that point, because they're reproducing, what we see is those advantageous characteristics are going to be passed on to the next generation. And hopefully this is sounding really familiar to us in terms of this is what natural selection is. Large numbers of offspring, variations amongst them because obviously they're not all genetically identical, best adapted will outcompete the others, survive longer, therefore reproduce, and pass on those advantageous alleles to the next generation. What we need to bear in mind though is that this wasn't just Charles Darwin who came up with this idea. There was actually a second scientist working on kind of the same thing, just in a completely different area. So we've got this second guy that no one knows the name of, Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, he was actually working pretty much on the opposite side of the world to Charles Darwin, and he was predominantly doing a lot of work in Southeast Asia. Did some work in the Amazon, but most of his work was around Southeast Asia, places like Borneo, etc. Now, what he was doing was exactly the same thing as Darwin. He was travelling around, he was making all these observations, collecting samples, lovely detailed sketches, and even though both himself and Darwin were working completely independently, they both ended up with the same theory about what was happening to cause these observations that they had. What we actually found was that the pair of them actually found out that they were both basically working on this same idea, and so they kind of shared notes to a certain extent, and because they were so similar in what they were saying, they decided to publish a joint paper on this subject of evolution by natural selection. So even though they worked completely independently, they both come up with this same overarching idea of evolution by natural selection. And so rather than trying to kind of beat one to the punch on it, they decided that they'd actually publish their joint paper, which was going to be backed up with evidence from these two completely independent studies at that point. So it added a bit more weight to their whole idea, if you like. Now, the reason that people still don't really know the name Alfred Russel Wallace, but we all know the name Charles Darwin, or at least a reasonable number, quiz shows would lead me to believe otherwise, is that Darwin then went on to publish a book. Now, the book he published was called On the Origin of Species, and the key reason that that made him more well known was when we publish work in scientific journals, then obviously that's going to a very small part of the entire population. It's going to other scientists on the most part, particularly back in the time of Darwin and Wallace. Now, where Charles Darwin then went on to write basically a book which was more designed for the general population to actually be able to read and find out about, that just gave him greater exposure, and therefore he became better known for this. So that's how they came up with these ideas, and obviously we're not just going to sit there and completely believe that what Darwin and Wallace said is absolutely the truth unless we've got a bit more evidence than a few sketches and samples of finches and the like. So since that point, we've actually been gathering more and more evidence to support this idea of evolution by natural selection. And the first bit of evidence that we have is through fossils. Hopefully we do remember that a fossil is basically the remains of plants and animals that have become mineralized, which basically means they become a rock, and they become buried underground. So if we think about what we're doing is we're digging up all these fossils, we're getting some kind of a preserved sample of animals or plants from the past. And the deeper underground we find those fossils, the older they are. So what we've been able to do is, from all of these different fossils that we've collected over many, many years, we've basically been able to work out, based on how deep they were underground, when they were actually alive, and therefore we've created this fossil record, this little sequence showing these gradual changes over time leading to the evolution. So one of the best examples that we have, the most complete examples of this fossil record, is for our little horse. Now, obviously you don't need to remember all of their names or anything like this. What we can see though is we start off with our little Eohippus down in the bottom left there. Now those ones are the ones I like to describe as little pocket ponies. They were teeny tiny little things. And obviously we see all these little minor changes, and you can see them in the pictures there, until we get up to our modern day horse that's still roaming in fields today. Certainly not a pocket pony, quite a considerable amount larger than the original 20 odd centimetres of little Eohippus. So we can track all of those gradual changes. We've got the fossils showing how the leg structure and the hoof structure has changed, how the overall size of these horses have changed. And therefore we can track all of those little changes over time, giving yet more evidence to this whole theory of natural selection leading to evolution. But we haven't stopped with fossils. As technology and science knowledge has advanced, we've actually been able to gather even more evidence. Because rather than just looking at, obviously, entire bone structures and the like from fossils, we can now look at individual biological molecules, look at the actual sequence that makes them up, and then compare them between all these different species. Because we've now got the technology and the scientific know-how to be able to sequence these things. And one thing we do know is that when we're looking at these biological molecules between species, the more closely related two species are to one another, then the more similar those molecules will be. And two great examples of biological molecules that we can use for this: cytochrome C, which is one of those actual molecules that we find in respiration. So any organism that respires has cytochrome C in it, hence why it's good to use as a comparison molecule. And DNA. As we know, DNA is universal. Every living thing here on planet Earth will have that DNA component, and therefore we can have a look. What are those sequences of the bases in there? How similar are the sequences of the DNA bases within a particular gene from one species to another? We can look at the sequence of the amino acids in the cytochrome C. How similar are they to one another? If there are large differences between those, then these organisms are not closely related. If there's only very minor differences, they will be closely related. So that's just given us even more evidence to support this idea that we've actually got a lot of these species having these very gradual changes over time, leading to evolution. As always, I do suggest you subscribe to the channel so you can see when I next upload a video, and of course head on over to my website where you can find a whole range of other A-level biology related stuff to hopefully help you in your studies.